Thanks, guys. Wow, that is a great song, isn't it? It's hopeful. I guess one of the big reasons we come to church is to get some hope, get some encouragement, to be together, as I said in the prayer, with good people, because that surely is encouraging. And so, we hope that when you come here or when you leave here today, that, something just made you feel a little more amazing, a little more hopeful. I do need to tell you that for those of you who are visiting, you might not know that we have several worshiping communities here. And one of them meets at 8:30 in the chapel, and I was already scheduled to speak to them this morning, and so I've done that. And so when Tom texted me yesterday and said, I'm pretty sick, the decision was made that I would bring that same sermon to you. Each of our worshiping communities is different, and so I wrote this for them, but of course I've been thinking about all of us as well. Well, since we're at 11:11, I have to start out by telling a story, which I didn't tell the folks in Disciple Church. But why do we do that? Because this is 11:11, and Tom McDermott, our regular pastor, is a great storyteller, and so I'm going to give this one a whirl. So there was a man who had 17 camels, and he died. And in the will, he left the 17 camels to his 3 sons. The will stated that that the oldest son would get 1/2 of the camels. The second son would get 1/3 of the camels, and the youngest son would get 1/9 of the camels. Well, as you well know, 17 cannot be divided in half. So how's the oldest son going to get half the camels? 17 cannot be divided by 3, so how's that middle son going to get a whole camel? Something's going to happen here. And the same thing, of course, with the number 9. You can't divide 17 by 9. The last son was to get 1/9 of the camels. So they got into a fight about it, the brothers. I'm supposed to get half, I'm supposed to get 1/3, I'm supposed to get 1/9. How is this going to work out with 17 camels? So finally they went and found a wise man. And he thought about it, and he decided that he would go home and get one of his camels and put it in the herd. And then he read the will again. The oldest son is to get 1/2. And so he got 9 camels. Half of 18 is 9. The middle son was to get 1/3. So you divide it by that, and you get 6 camels. And then finally, the youngest son was left with 1/9 of 18 camels, and so he got 2. Well, when you add those numbers up, there's a camel left over. Because 9 plus 6 plus 2 is 17. So here's the moral of that crazy story. When we have to solve problems, sometimes we just have to be a little bit innovative. We have to be a little amazing, a little brilliant. Now, hang on to that idea. It might be useful in this sermon. As I said, it was not an original part of the sermon, but it's a funny story, isn't it? It's thinking out of the box. So here's the thing. Always remember the 18th camel. Just keep that hanging around your head. It'll be useful, I'm sure, one of these days. Guess what today is? Today is Transfiguration Sunday. That's a time when the Christian church has, for a very long time, recognized that story in the Gospels that Brad read to us. A time when Peter and James and John go up on the mountain with Jesus, and this amazing thing happens. The older English versions used to say he was transfigured, which really just means he was changed. But as you heard in the reading of the story, it was kind of a knock you off your socks kind of change. He was like bursting at the seams with light, Jesus was. And so this amazing language that we find, and all of the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're the 3 who tell it, they all speak in similar terms. Depending on the version, you might see dazzling, you might see bright, but the whole thing is this spectacular vision of what is also called glory. And so using these extreme words, you figure out they're trying to say something important is happening here. Well, beyond the spectacular change of his body and his clothing, of course, Moses and Elijah show up. Now, remember that Peter, James, and John and Jesus were all Jewish men, and Moses and Elijah were pretty important figures in Israelite and Jewish history. Moses was that great lawgiver, the one who led the children of Israel out of Egyptian slavery. And he went up on the mountain and he got the words of God. Elijah was a real bold prophet who called even kings to task if they weren't living by the social and the judicial ways that God had laid out for them. He insisted that they do. So here are these important people of the faith standing there with Jesus and Peter, James, and John. So if all of that were not exciting enough, then this voice from heaven says, "This is my son. Listen to him." Now, as is the case with every story in the Bible, there's a long history of interpretation, right? We know that Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote down their stories several decades after Jesus had already been here. And what's important for us to know about that is they were writing down memories. They were writing down stories that they had been told. And so these stories have been passed down. And as they write them down, what's important for us to think about is these were people in the early church who were formulating what they would believe about Jesus. Now, this happened. This is what it means. So they were interpreting for us already. And so the standard interpretation that arose out of this whole thing focused on, "This is my son, listen to him." Right beside that focus, a very unfortunate and poor interpretation also emerged. And it emerged because of the ongoing conflicts between some Jewish people and some Christian people. Some Christian people began to take this story to mean Jesus was triumphing over Moses and Elijah. And as the Christian church grew in power, and by the 3rd century it was the state church, according to the Roman Empire and the emperor, so grew a strong strand of anti-Semitism, which is hatred for the Jews. And this story is one of the stories that fed into that bad interpretation. Jesus was triumphing over Moses and Elijah. Well, I think that's an unnecessary and questionable interpretation. What might be better is to think that the presence of Moses and Elijah was a way of affirming the importance of Jesus. Just as Moses and Elijah had spoken the will of God, so Jesus is going to speak the will of God, and one should listen. Now, it is true that the Bible talks about Jesus fulfilling Moses and Elijah, but somehow that language got co-opted into this business of triumphalism. And I just want to say that triumphalism has been a dark shadow in Christian history. Well, however we sort out interpreting that, however we all decide what that means, one thing I feel pretty sure about is that listen to Jesus, as the voice from heaven said, would never give anybody at any time in any place the right to persecute and hate the Jews or anyone else. So that triumphalism has cast that long and dark shadow. Well, so as exciting as the brilliance of the mountaintop story was, with the bright clothes and the face shining and the appearance of Moses and Elijah and this big, voice from heaven, Jesus was changed, transfigured in it. I think, as exciting as all of that was, maybe the real question for us, all of these centuries later, the question that has to be asked again and again is, how are we changed? How are we changed by listening to Jesus? And to get at that, I want to tell you a few more things that happened after they came down from the mountaintop. We didn't include that in the scripture reading, but here's some things that happened. We all know about going on the mountaintop, right? You got to come down after a while. That's just how life is. So first thing, they get down to the floor of the valley or wherever they are, and somebody runs up to Jesus and the disciples, and it's a man with a sick child. And he says, "My son is very sick. I need you to heal him. And I asked your disciples to do it, and they couldn't." Well, right off the mountaintop, and you got a problem you cannot solve. Do any of you have problems you can't solve? Anybody ever run into a problem you can't solve? After everything is going so good, and then suddenly a problem you can't solve. That's life on the earth. That's how it is. After those times of inspiration and wonder, real life happens, and there's so many problems we can't solve. Now, it's easy to rush to the end of that story and say, well, Jesus healed him. But if that story is going to have any real meaning for me, I'm going to have to pause and realize that real life means problems I can't solve. So here's what many of us often do in the face of problems we cannot solve. and y'all can help me. You can blame somebody else, right? That's a good strategy. Or you could just stick your head in the sand and pretend like there are no problems, right? You like that one? That one could work. And, you could always just resign yourself and say, no solutions here. That's it. But of course, what would be really best when we face seemingly intractable problems is to get together and work on it. Get together and try to figure out a solution. Well, the problem with that is we're not so good at it. And so this is where I want to say again, maybe that voice from heaven is useful. While we're trying to solve our problems, listen to Jesus. And most of you know me well enough to say, and I need to be really clear about this, when I say listen to Jesus, I'm not just trying to spout some kind of memorized phrase like an apple a day keeps the doctor away and I never eat apples. Or money doesn't grow on trees, but I spend it like I have a tree in the backyard. When I say listen to Jesus, I'm not trying to sound religious. What I am trying to say is, when we approach our problems, what if we took Jesus' two top agenda items, neighbor love and self-sacrifice, and we brought them to bear on the problems that we are facing? Now, even if we do that, there's not going to be any fast solutions. And most certainly, it will not always work out like I envisioned, with all my wisdom and strategies in place. But maybe if we did that, we could at least avoid the ditches of hatred, of disrespect, of destroying each other. And that would just be no small thing. So maybe thinking about neighbor love, which was big on Jesus' list, and self-sacrifice could be useful. Okay, so something else happened. They had this problem, and they couldn't solve it. The next thing that happens in the story of Matthew is that Jesus calls the disciples aside, and he starts talking about what's ahead of him. And it is suffering, and it is death. I'm like, geez, I'd like to just stay on the mountain. Well, why do we have to talk about suffering and dying? But again, this is how it is on the earth, right? We don't get to live on the mountain all the time. Suffering and death are a part of living, and some people try to escape that too, just like trying to escape our problems. Some people try to escape that by isolating themselves, making sure they're pretty uninvolved with troublesome people or things. That's a way to avoid suffering. And this is something we often accuse rich people of. We say, what rich people do is they take care of themselves. They don't care about the suffering of others. They, again, isolate. We say that's the big sin of the rich people. Well, surely all of us rich people need to pay attention to that, right? But the fact of the matter is, I know rich people and poor people who look after themselves and not after others. It's part of living on the earth. Our feet are on the ground, and this is how we are, unfortunately. This is how we are. But once again, if we listen to Jesus, if we pay attention to how he was, how he entered into suffering, he didn't stay away from those people who are in desperate need. He didn't stay away from people who didn't know they had desperate need. He didn't stay away from the arrogant, the hard to get along with, and the people who were righteous in their own eyes. He entered into that kind of suffering. Surely when we think of suffering in Jesus, we think about his death, but there's a little more to think about. He entered into the suffering of trying to love people who are hard to love, who have more needs than we can cover, who are more arrogant than we think we can put up with, and certainly we are hoping people are entering into our life too, because we need that kind of attention and compassion. And so maybe listening to Jesus is a way to enter into suffering, because we're going to have to. And then there's death. Yes, Jesus' death has particular meaning for the Christian faith, and there's lots of interpretations of Jesus' death. Some we talk about a lot, some not so much. One thing that's really important to me and meaningful to me is to notice that Jesus died because of sin. And wait, I know we're Methodist, we don't say much about sin. But let's put it another way. Jesus died because people are violent. Jesus died because people love power. And we will kill other people to protect our perceived power. This is why Jesus died. Jesus died because of lack of understanding, not his. For Christians, Jesus' willingness to live as he did anyway, challenging a worldview that says violence and power and greed are the way to survival, challenging the pseudo-religious idea that says God is the property of just a few. He challenged that all the time. And yes, he died anyway. But when he died, on his lips were the most astounding words: "Forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." So the final thing that I'll note that happened on the mountaintop, or after they came down from the mountain, is that you'll never believe this one. The disciples got into an argument. That's outrageous, isn't it? They got into an argument over who's the greatest. How do you argue about who's ever the greatest? I guess, in fact, that's what all arguments about, right? My ego, my conviction, my truth, my way, my possessions, my stuff, my land. Don't cross me. Don't question me. Don't bother me with your different ideas. Now, we all get into these situations. We all are part of these problems that I just laid out. All of this arguing. And we're draining the rivers of life with that kind of stuff. And that's how it is. It's how it is to live here. Hopefully, many of us work through a lot of our arguments and we get through things. But I think we all know that this, too, is part of our common humanity. We have a hard time getting along. So life after the mountaintop is not as brilliant, not as exciting as it was up there. And yet, there is still the memory of the brilliance, of the inspiration, of the time when we were our best self, where we understood things about God and life in a way that we hadn't before. The memory of that helps us decide to be amazing, help us to know that we will be amazing. The memory of it keeps that light shining in our minds. Sometimes we might have to shine the light for each other because it's kind of hard to access sometimes when you're down and having a hard time. Sometimes we borrow the light from each other. But the truth is, the light is there. Just like the song we sang earlier, no matter what you do, love will find you. We could say the same thing about this light of inspiration, this sense that we are loved and that we have power to work through all of the things that we must work through in this life. And so that's our faith story. No matter what you've heard, that light has never yet completely been snuffed out. Amen.